Alright guys, this is the final section of Standard 2. It's called Democracy in Changing Times. We pick up from yesterday with our discussion of people moving west and the sectionalism that begins to divide our country. We're going to take a little bit of a step backwards and continue to see how that progression of sectionalism has developed over the course of the decade or so leading up to the Civil War. So as more and more settlers move west to the frontier, I remember for a variety of reasons. We talked about 3 reasons yesterday: religion, gold, and land. As those people push west, they kind of separate themselves from those that live in the north and in the south. And those living on the west, on the frontier, not really having any true connection to the people back on the east coast, they start this cry for what we call a true democracy, which is different from the type of democracy that we have now. We have a representative democracy, and what they had back then was also a representative democracy. But they wanted more of a direct or true democracy, meaning that the people themselves literally have the say in how the laws are made, as opposed to people that they elect to take those decisions for them. So it would be important to kind of make a side note off to the left or the right, determining that what the true democracy really is. So the Constitution, as we know, established a republic. But as we gather more and more people from different countries around the world, that type of government wasn't really satisfying to the citizens anymore. They wanted to have equal say in their government, and by this point, as we get into the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, they're kind of sick and tired of the elite ruling class that was just winning elections over and over and over again. And the people who only had a say in the government were those that were white and had owned land. They were the only ones that had the ability to vote. They were typically the ones that were in charge as well. So it was a very white male-run society going all the way back to the founding fathers of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Now, going back to those Westerners, they were small landowners, some of them being pioneers, meaning they don't really own a whole lot of land. They definitely don't own enough land to vote. Now, most of them weren't white, but you had to have a certain amount of land in order to have the ability to vote, because you had to basically be somebody in order to have that voice in government. So these people wanted that opportunity to have more voice in how they were going to be governed. When we get into the election of 1824, Westerners and those that were poor South began to have their candidate. It wasn't a rich white guy. It was somebody who was considered the common man. He had been a war hero in the War of 1812, and he used that popularity to get into politics. You should know Andrew Jackson was a key player in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and the Battle of New Orleans, 2 battles that actually took place after the Treaty of Ghent was signed in the War of 1812. Shortly after that, he will become a representative and then later a senator. And he is a rags to riches story. Grew up extremely poor. Was able to make his wealth through his work. And then eventually will become a wealthy slave owner as well. But he could relate to the struggles of everyday Americans because that was his past, unlike any of the other presidents we had had up to this point. So in 1824, Jackson does decide to run for president. He used his background of being raised on the Tennessee frontier, and he celebrated a majority rule, meaning that the people would decide. And he kind of rose up the dignity of ordinary Americans. So in 1824, he runs for presidency, and he will end up facing off. There's Andrew Jackson as a young lad in the War of 1812. And here is Andrew Jackson on the left, and the gentleman he will end up facing off against in 1824 in the final election, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. Now, if you wanted any type of true representation of how divided our country is, besides the examples we talked about yesterday, the election of 1824 is that. And what happens in the election of 1824 is you have several candidates. New England will back John Quincy Adams. Southerners are going to back William Crawford of Georgia, and then Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson were candidates for the West. The election will eventually come down to John Adams and Andrew Jackson, and the voting had been so close in the primary election that it had to come down to the House of Representatives to decide the winner. And this is where the issue comes into play. So you see the voting makeup here, the percentages and the electoral votes for the election of 1824. So Henry Clay will throw his support behind John Quincy Adams. And this, after Adams won, this is where things get a little sticky, because he will appoint Henry Clay as Secretary of State. And so this is where the quote-unquote corrupt bargain comes into play, because he was a major political person, Henry Clay was, and he throws his support publicly to one of the candidates, convincing other people to sway their votes as well. And so Andrew Jackson and his party will call this a corrupt bargain. And so what happens is Andrew Jackson's supporters will break off, and they'll create a entirely new political party called the Democratic Party, otherwise known as the Jacksonians. So one of the issues that Andrew Jackson had was the fact that he won 56% of the popular vote. And so according to him, he should have then had the election in his hand. But the problem is after the popular vote, we should all know by this point that the voting goes to the Electoral College, and it's truly the Electoral College that actually nominates the candidate. So once that creates a stalemate or a tie, that's why it had to go to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives end up choosing John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson, though, will not kind of let that beat him down. What he ends up doing is, for the next 4 years, kind of creating what we would call today a smear campaign, and hitting John Quincy Adams as many times as possible with the corrupt bargain and some of the policies that will be instituted during his presidency. And in 1828, 4 years later, Andrew Jackson is able to beat John Quincy Adams. And as soon as he takes office, going back to some of the things we talked about yesterday, in 1828 you get what's called the Tariff of Abominations, which you should remember is a tariff that was proposed to increase taxes on imported goods to 62% to encourage trade with the North, the manufacturing and purchasing of goods made in America. And that's when we get into the nullification crisis, which yours truly, South Carolina, threatens to leave the Union, and that is when Andrew Jackson will pass the Force Bill, which kind of sets the stage for what Andrew Jackson was going to be about. Despite the fact that he was for the common man, that Force Bill illustrates that Andrew Jackson will do whatever means necessary to ensure that he is the boss and in charge of the country and not other people. One thing he'll push for, which inspires this idea of Jacksonian democracy, will be what we call universal suffrage. So he was all about westward expansion. We've kind of already laid some of those things out through the 1830s, and you've got the Trail of Tears, the Indian Removal Act, and all that. That's part of Andrew Jackson's presidency. But he is going to push for a removal of Eastern elites being in charge and more of the common person. And that's where universal suffrage comes in, because universal suffrage means that he wanted everybody to have the ability to vote. All white men have the ability to vote, to eliminate the land criteria that was necessary back during this time to actually have the ability to vote. So the common man will rule in America if Andrew Jackson has anything to say about it. When it comes to the Indian Removal Act, which was instituted in 1832, the Supreme Court is going to rule, 1838, the Supreme Court is going to rule in 1832 that Georgia and the United States does not have the authority to take Indian lands, that it was deemed unconstitutional. But Jackson refuses to act in any way to stop it from occurring. And he actually says, John Marshall, who's the Supreme Court justice during this period in history, he says, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. The downside to this is it's the executive branch that is supposed to enforce the laws. It's the judicial branch that interprets the laws. So it was Andrew Jackson's goal, or it was Andrew Jackson's job to enforce the law, and that was something that he did not do. Here's a political cartoon illustrating for you the perfect political equality, the parliamentary heights, the summit at last. This is supposed to be a representation of Andrew Jackson bringing up the common man of America to establish that perfect political equality that the common man was really after. So the spoils system. We had the corrupt bargain with John Quincy Adams, and now we get into the spoils system. And Andrew Jackson, once he is in office, he starts rewarding his supporters with government positions. Sounds a whole lot like the corrupt bargain. In this case, he wanted to give jobs instead of on merit based off of supporters. So people would get the job because they know somebody versus having any true merit in that specific field. Jackson believed that it was a great way to get common people to become politically involved. However, it eventually led to corruption and needed reform. Anytime you give a job to somebody you know, they're more likely to backstab you than they are to follow through and actually get the job done. There was a book written by Niccolo Machiavelli called The Prince back in the 1500s, I believe, and he writes about how it is better to be loved than it is to be feared. It's better to be feared than to be loved, because if you love somebody, you know that they're always going to love you back, and you feel as though you have a little bit of leeway and want to bend the rules a little bit. But if you fear somebody, you're fearful of the repercussions of disappointing them, or you're fearful of what would happen if you don't do exactly as they say. And so, in this case, he wants to eliminate the idea of merit and give jobs specifically on friendship. And that will lead to a lot of corruption during his presidency, and why Andrew Jackson's not really deemed as one of the greatest presidents of all time, because of those things that occurred during his presidency. He also favored something called laissez-faire economics, which is an extremely important term. What that means is little to no government intervention. He didn't believe that there should be any type of big government when it comes to the economy. The economy should run based off of the people, based off of the market. So there were very little government regulations that will be passed during his presidency, and that's primarily because he was a strict constructionist, which meant that he believed the Constitution was what the Constitution was. And he believed the president should have more power than the Congress, because the president was chosen by the people, one person by the people, versus a group of people in Congress that have a hard time getting along, which made things a little bit more complicated. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we are going to stop for this video.